Good morning, everyone. This is Aya and Drew from NovoEd. Welcome to our third webinar of the Foundations of Learning Experience Design series, the Foundations of Learning, Unlocking Your Learner's Potential. I'm really excited to introduce to you my colleague, Drew Remiker, who is right here. This is going to be a great presentation. This is us. And just before we start, a couple of housekeeping. The questions that you ask are only visible to the instructional design team, and I will be answering the questions as they come in. So please feel free to ask any questions you have at any point during the webinar. And at the very end, we'll select the ones that are relevant to everybody and address them at the Q&A, time permitting. And if we're unable to answer your questions today, we'll make sure to respond to you individually by email. And the recording and the slides will be distributed after the webinar. So without further ado, here's Drew.
Thank you, Aya. Thank you all for joining me today. Because we are in election season, we are going to start things off with a very quick poll. So I'd like you to take just 1 minute to answer this poll that I'm about to launch. And the question here is, which of the following challenges have you experienced when designing a training or a lesson? So you can select as many of these as relate to you. Having your learners complete the training, literally just making it to the end. Keeping learners excited about a training, so making sure they're excited about it as it continues. Helping learners see the real application of the training, or none of these. I'm an amazing instructional designer. And I see most of you have voted, so let's take another 15 seconds. Make sure you get your vote in, and I see we've got a couple of amazing instructional designers. That's great. In about 5 more seconds. Make sure to get your vote in. Okay. So let me share the results real quick. So it seems that a lot of you, struggle with having your learners complete the training, making it all the way to the end. But the biggest issue, it appears, is keeping learners excited about a training. How do you really engage people so they can, stay excited as it progresses? And then helping learners see the real application, that's another issue. And then, 2% of you are an amazing instructional designers. So hopefully you find value in today's webinar. But thanks for being honest. It's great to have you experts out there. So today's webinar, really, we're going to hit on all these topics, with the idea of, really unlocking your learners' potential. How do you get them to complete a training, to be excited, and really see that application? So I wanted to start today after this poll by telling a little story about my teaching experience that really informed what this webinar is going to be about today. So I want to take you back in time to 2008 when I started my career in education as a middle school math teacher in the Bronx. And you can see here on the left a little snippet of what I was doing at the time. And I was honestly incredibly excited about teaching. I made a series of math music videos for my students, and I just had a blast. And I thought I was doing a fantastic job. So you can see over here on the left, I was talking to my students about factors and multiples and trying to get them to understand the concept of greatest common factor and least common multiple. And I collaborated here with my colleague, Mr. Sarli, and we combined our names, Remiker and Sarli, to form Mr. Remikarli. And you can actually see some of these videos on our YouTube channel of Remikarli. And so at the time, honestly, we thought we were doing a fantastic job of teaching. We thought this really engaged our students. But if you see over on the right-hand side of my screen, this was the sort of classwork we were giving to our students. So, kind of rudimentary, just basic, solving the problem, and honestly, it was a little disappointing to see at the end of our classes at times, we'd see their classwork end up on the floor. It was not something they really valued. And while we thought our videos were engaging and exciting, the work that our students were producing, honestly, wasn't as valuable to them as it could have been. So I'm going to fast forward 4 years later when I started actually teaching as an English teacher in 2012 with another colleague by the name of Mr. Fatchler. And we actually had our students write various project-based articles and poems that they would write. One of them was the Where I'm From poem. So students would talk about their experience of growing up in the Bronx and how this impacted their lives. And they also wrote argumentative essays. And these projects they would work on week to week, and they would continually improve on them, and they would actually share them with each other to get feedback, not only from their peers, but also from us as instructors. And over time, they could actually see how their writing would improve, how they would, this one piece of work would over time become something that they were really excited about. And you would never see this sort of writing, their poems or their essays on the floor. This is something they valued, they would keep with them, and they would continually work on. So they definitely had this sense of pride in their work. And this is really where I started to see the value of project-based learning and designing activities and projects for my students that really had meaning for them. So what we decided to do in our math class is really take over or transition the camera and the creative process to our students so that by the end of our year, they were the ones actually scripting music, actually scripting videos and filming their own math music videos, which we saw actually had a much greater impact in terms of their investment in the class. These were videos they were incredibly proud of. We ended up having a movie viewing session where they showed the entire school what they'd come up with. And these sorts of projects actually carried much more weight and value to our students than the ones we had created. And so the biggest takeaway from this experience is this quote, which is, I used to spend more time thinking about how to teach rather than how my students could experience learning. So instead of thinking about how I might present this information in an engaging way, I really started to think more about how my students could apply what they had learned and really engage in meaningful experiences for them. So in summary, music videos that students make, argumentative essays and poems, and these sorts of projects that they can invest time in and continue to build on are much greater and more valuable than simple worksheets and practice activities that honestly could be thrown away or left on the floor. So I want to talk a little bit about the theory behind these ideas and focusing on three main ones. So the research supports this emphasis of activities and experiences over instruction. And the three that I'm going to talk about briefly today are Bloom's taxonomy, Malcolm Knowles' 4 principles of andragogy, and the 70-20-10 model. So I want to start with Bloom's taxonomy, which if you're a K-12 educator, this is something you've probably seen, which is the idea that when you're creating a lesson or experience for your students, there's really a set of thinking verbs that you can incorporate. But the real challenge is coming up with those activities and experiences that do more than have students simply remember and understand material. It's more about having them apply it, analyze, evaluate, and create their own learning experiences. And these are what we call higher order thinking skills. And these sorts of activities that involve these skills have shown to have a greater impact on retention of learning, as well as having real viable learning experiences that last over time. Now, Malcolm Knowles' 4 principles of andragogy. So this is something that Malcolm Knowles came up with in 1984. It suggested there are 4 principles that are applied to adult learning, but I actually want to make the case that these also could very much apply to elementary school students as well. I think it's very relevant for them. So let's talk about each point. So number 1, adults need to be involved in the planning and evaluation of their instruction. So again, the value of choice and flexibility. How do you give your learners an opportunity to decide where are they going to invest their efforts? What sort of project, what sort of activities are they going to be doing? The more you involve them in the process, the better it is. The second one is experience, providing the basis for learning activities. So rather than giving a worksheet or some sort of quiz, how do you actually involve your learners in real experiences that lead to long-term retention? And the third point, relevance and impact to learners' lives. So if it has relevance to your life, if it has relevance to your job, these are the things that are much more valuable. So how do you design these sorts of projects or experiences that have real relevance? And the last is this problem-centered versus a content-oriented approach. The idea being that learners aren't here just to view the content that you present to them, but they're really trying to solve problems in their lives. And hopefully, as a result of their learning experience, they have a solution or a set of solutions. And the last theory is the 70-20-10 model, which we see more in corporate education. This was created in the 1980s by the Center for Creative Leadership, where they researched key developmental experiences of successful managers. And what they discovered was that real learning, real retention of skills doesn't happen as much in formal learning or even informal learning with peers. The majority of learning happens on the job with these real experiences. So the 70-20-10 model is something we'd like to advocate and say, how do you actually allow people to take their learning and apply it in the real world or on their job to have real impact? So these are the main theories that are the basis for the foundations of real learning experience. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of the best practices that we see in designing these sorts of experiences. So this is something we'll focus more on next week as my colleague Charlie talks about backwards design, but it's worth mentioning here about the process of designing great learning experiences, which is really kind of 3 steps here. The first being identifying the skills and knowledge you want your learners to develop. So really taking the time to think, what would be valuable skills? What do I want them to know as a result of this experience? That's really step 1. And then once you've identified those, then it's time to design authentic activities that would demonstrate this learning, which is mainly the focus of our conversation today. And then the third step is determining the content or resources that support the activity. So this is really where I kind of had this backwards as an early middle school teacher, thinking so much about how I was going to present the content and how I was going to basically put myself on a stage and excite my learners by, the music and the videos we create. But really, that should be the last step in supporting the learning journey. So as I mentioned today, we're going to be focusing on this second step of designing authentic activities that demonstrate real learning. I want to talk a little bit about some of the qualities we see in great learning activities. So the first is authentic real-world context. So how do you provide a learning experience that really mimics real life or could in fact take place in real life? The more you can design an experience where there is that relevance and that real application, that's where you see learners stay engaged and they're actually excited because they know it's going to help them. The next thing is project-based. So how do you give them something tangible that they can take away at the end of a learning experience and say, I'm proud of this. This is something that I've worked on. This is something that has taken me time to develop and was really a great artifact of my learning. Next, can you allow for flexibility? So as Malcolm Knoll says, if you can give people choice, if you can give people opportunities to decide, what sort of project or where they're going to focus their energy, it's incredibly valuable, and you'll see that they'll be more invested and they'll stay engaged. The other thing is it can be team-based or individualized. So in the case studies today, you'll see an example of a project that was really created for individuals, but also another one where you can actually involve multiple people in the creation of that project. And the last point here is it incorporates 21st century skills, which we know will be valuable beyond the course or learning experience itself, which are critical thinking, cooperation, communication, and creativity. So if your projects and your experience can involve these sorts of skills, it'll be worthwhile in the future as well. Now let's talk a little bit about 2 specific case studies that we found that did an excellent job of incorporating these best practices. So I'm going to start with case study 1. So we were working with a Fortune 50 company as they developed a course on exploring leadership. And this was a course where first-time managers were learning basic skills of communication, of leadership. And the idea was, as a result of their learning experience, they were supposed to work with a manager to design, present, and apply a leadership in action project in the workplace. And I want to take this point by point because I think it's important. So first, working with a manager. So they were actually expected to work with people who weren't necessarily involved in the course, but actually make connections to their work and actually involve people who would be impacted by the learning. So this was a really great approach, and something we highly recommend is to get people out of just the course environment to interact with people where their skills are going to be applied. And next, to design. So as we talked about Bloom's taxonomy and the idea that these higher order thinking skills are so valuable, the ability to analyze an issue at work and actually design a solution, again, it's going to be one of those really valuable skills that is more challenging than simply remembering or recalling facts. And then they had to present their plan. So again, working with those 21st century skills of communication. This is incredibly valuable when you give people an opportunity to share in front of a live audience what it is they've come up with, and then finally applying it in the workplace. So again, taking it from beyond just the course and then making it meaningful to their job. So let's talk a little bit about the impact, and I want to highlight one of the learner quotes from this experience. And they said, "Through doing the Leadership in Action project, I was forced to go out of my comfort zone and do a presentation in front of my peers. I had never done any kind of presentation in my professional career, so this was a big step for me. My manager and director were really impressed." So again, this is valuable. Not only did they have to present, but they actually were seen in a positive light by their manager and director because they were working on their presentation skills. And this was something, as they mentioned, out of their comfort zone, and they actually got to improve on something that was valuable to them. And the last part of this quote says, "I'm not sure if I would have done this if I hadn't taken the course, so I'm glad I went through with it, and I've definitely come out of it with more confidence and experience." So again, the value of those real experiences. How do you give your learners an experience that they're going to value and that's going to be similar to something that they would have to do in real life? So that's something we really strive to do in our courses, is encourage people to design these learning experiences that are going to be meaningful. The next case study comes from our great partner, Presidio Institute, in a course about building teams. And the idea behind this course was their focus is on cross-sector leadership. The idea being that people from different sectors, whether it's nonprofit or government or the private sector, can come together to solve real-world issues. And so in this course, their main project they had people do was utilize team building strategies in a virtual team and collaborate on a strategy to address a real world issue. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So they had videos and they had articles that people were expected to read, but then they actually had to find teammates to work together to apply these practices in this virtual setting. So it went just beyond thinking and reflecting of how they might use them, but they actually had to come together and practice the skills of developing trust, managing power dynamics and conflict, and fostering an innovation culture. And they actually practice these things with teammates. And again, that's the fact that they got to choose their teammates, again, offered that little bit of flexibility, having the learners actually participate in their own design of the experience. And the last thing they had to do was collaborate on a strategy to address a real world issue. And so you can see on the right hand side of my screen just a cover page from one of those teams, the Odd Squad, who presented this case study that was focused on Albuquerque, with the idea being there's an issue there to try to help communities of color and immigrants and low-income populations actually see entrepreneurship as an economic mobility tool. So their project was to focus on how they might create this cross-sector collaboration to ultimately impact the lives of people in Albuquerque. So let's talk a little bit about the impact we saw with a learner quote. And the quote is, "I believe the course provided ample opportunity to put the readings and the videos into practice as we tried to work with our teams. We could both discuss the ideas presented in the group as well as practice the principles. I also noticed how the course was reshaping my participation in teams outside of the class." So again, having the opportunity not only to think and reflect and recall these ideas, but really practice them and apply them with real people. This was seen as incredibly valuable by the participants. And then, as you can see, they said it reshaped their participation in teams outside of class. It shows that this was very relevant to the work they had to do. So if this is something that can be applied outside of the work or outside of the course, it's incredibly valuable to the learner. So with that, that's the end of my presentation, but now I'd like to open it up for Q&A. And to practice what I preach, the more involved you are in this experience, the better it is going to be for you. So I'm going to transition now to see some of the questions that you all have asked along the way. Okay. So is the ideal course planning based off backwards design in a way? Yes, absolutely. So backwards design is exactly the framework we use to try to encourage designing great experiences. So really reflecting on those transferable skills and knowledge, and then thinking about the actual activities, and then actually the elements of content that would support it. So it's absolutely backwards design. And now I hear, can you show slide number 22 again? Let's see, let's go back. I think what they meant is 23, or perhaps this one. Yeah, slide 21. So the question is this related to adult learning or just with young people, I ask, because this is similar to traditional learning principles. And I think you're absolutely right. Honestly, when people talk about the difference between educating adults and educating students, oftentimes I really try to break that barrier down and say a lot of the same principles can be applied. I mean, being able to work cooperatively, being able to communicate, it's not just relevant for students, for children, but they're also relevant for adults. So absolutely, these traditional training principles should be applied in all contexts. What is the best way for engaging people at the digital era when they prepare to stay concentrated at their smartphones and their BYA? So how do you engage people in the digital era? Well, so one of the things we're really excited about at NovoEd is the idea that learning can happen really anywhere and anytime. And with the launch of our NovoEd 2.0, that's something we're excited to actually encourage, which is that people should be able to learn on their smartphones. There can be times when people are in their own worlds, commuting, walking to work, and they can have an opportunity to really, listen to a podcast or engage in learning there. But one of the things we do often encourage is to actually take people away from that environment to actually apply these skills in real life. So how do you actually encourage people to get away from their phones and get away from their computers and do something that is meaningful? How do you evaluate whether you have achieved the learning objectives? Are there different evaluation models for Bloom's levels of learning? So this is a really important point about evaluation. And so one of the things we highly encourage when designing project-based learning is to come up with a rubric for those final projects. Now, again, you can keep the project actually flexible in nature in terms of the types of deliverables, in terms of whether it's a video, whether it's some sort of PowerPoint, whether it's really a written piece. But the important thing to do is to provide that rubric, those guidelines of what you're looking for in terms of expected quality. So that's one of the things we very much encourage and we like to work with our partners on is designing that evaluation tool. Let's see. Can you talk about the transition from planning to implementation with team development of curriculum? Planning to implementation. So one of the principles that we also utilize a lot is this idea of prototyping and feedback. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of design thinking. So What we often do is we don't know exactly how team-based learning or projects are going to work the first time around. The best thing you can do is really experiment and then iterate. So one of the things we noticed in one of our projects was we actually assigned people to teams based on their time zones to figure out what, maybe this will result in having the best opportunity for people to interact. And we saw that this actually didn't work as well as giving people the opportunity to make a choice and choose their teammates, whether they were in the same time zone or not. So in terms of planning, you can do the best job you can think of and try to come up with a great experience, but ultimately you really have to rely on your learners' feedback to figure out what the best experience is going to be. And so that's something we also encourage heavily, is really take the time to listen to your learners as they go through your experience and take their feedback to heart and understand how might this be improved for a future experience. Another question is, to which extent do you consider different generational styles of learning when developing a learning activity? That's a very interesting point. Oftentimes, a lot of our courses actually do have kind of a defined audience. But if you do have a course with different levels of I guess, age and different generations, then you can actually differentiate assignments. So again, how do you allow for that flexibility? So whereas you might have a younger participant who's more comfortable recording a video on their smartphone, maybe what you want your older participants to do is to actually demonstrate their knowledge in the form of a Word doc, right? So that's something, again, you can use differentiation to address those different levels of readiness to use technology, but ultimately you can accomplish the same sort of task by actually creating different deliverable options that maybe cater to different generations. Someone asks, how do I go beyond the constraints of a curriculum? I think that's tough. Depending on the situation you're in, you might have given parameters in terms of what you're expected to teach and how you're expected to teach it. The one thing I would recommend is if possible to be an advocate for 21st century learning. And if there's ways to integrate maybe smaller experiments in your curriculum and say, I know the curriculum is intended to do this. I thought maybe I'll try this. And if you have any flexibility, figure out how you might incorporate a small project or maybe team-based activity. Maybe not rehaul an entire curriculum, but if there's ways you can gain ground. I know I'm working with one partner who's still struggles with the idea of incorporating more collaborative activities, but they actually worked it into one of their future trainings to have it serve as a proof point that this is something that can actually be valuable. So I would say I don't envy the position you're in, but if you can make small gains by applying some of these ideas in small chunks, then you'll have a better chance of pulling off a more substantial change. How do you deal with situations where one or more teammates in an online group project don't pull their weight or otherwise absent? With in-person learning, it's easier to maintain accountability, but when the participants are all remote, a teammate can basically vanish without explanation, and then the other teammate has to do the whole project alone. This is something we see all the time. And so one of the things we try to do to avoid this, because you can't fully avoid this, but we try to preempt this by setting some group guidelines and ground rules. And one of the things we try to do is present this in the form of a document that says, this might be your first team meeting agenda, these might be some roles, but one of the things that we also try to say is, if you plan to disappear from your team, then one of the things you can do is let them know your situation. At the very least, communicate with your team that you may no longer be participating. And while that doesn't help them out, at least they know the types of resources they will have access to in terms of human resources in working on a project. So the other thing I'd recommend doing is, when putting people in teams, invest the time in having them bond as a team. The more they get to know each other as people, the more they are invested in each other as teammates, the less likely it is that people will actually disappear from those teams. So that's something we'd highly encourage. And finally, the last question is, can you share some more instructional design wisdom? What have you recently learned that everyone would benefit from knowing? Let me think about this. Instructional design wisdom. I mean, I think honestly, one of the most valuable things I've learned in especially listening to the other webinars we've had with IDEO, for instance, is the value of experimentation. And I really like working with them. I like working with Presidio Institute because they're not afraid. They're not afraid to try new things. And that's one of the things I highly encourage is even though it might be something new, it might be a little intimidating, if you can just try one mini experiment just to see how it goes, it's something your learners will really appreciate because it's novel, it's exciting, and then you can learn from it. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. But to not be afraid of failure and to not be afraid of experimenting in your design is one of the things I want you encouraged to do, because then you can share and share your wisdom as well. So thank you all for taking the time today. This has been great for me. And thanks all of you for writing in your questions. The ones we didn't get into, we will make sure to answer by email. So thank you all for your time, and we'll be sending out a recording to follow up as well. All right. Have a great rest of your day.